Hello everyone, let's get started. Today we're going to be continuing our discussion of the skeletal system, and we're going to focus on the joints. Remember, when we use that term skeletal system, we're talking about bones, cartilage, ligaments, tendons, and joints. We said that bone and cartilage are both types of supporting connective tissue, with bone being the type with a solid matrix and cartilage having a semi-solid matrix. We said that tendons and ligaments, in comparison, are made out of dense, regular connective tissue proper. Now, the joints are a combination of structures, and what particular combination is present depends upon the joint type. But it will be some combination of bone and ligament and tendon and perhaps menisci. There'll be joint capsules around certain joints. There'll be bursa associated with certain joints. And some joints actually have fluid around them called synovial fluid. When we use the word joint, what we're saying is there is an articulation or a point of contact between bones. And sometimes it's two bones and sometimes it's more than two bones. Now, the study of the joints is a branch of its own in anatomy and physiology. It's referred to as arthrology. Joints can be classified both by their anatomical structure and by the way they function, by the way they move. Let's begin with the structural classification of joints. There are three different types of joints from a structural standpoint. There are what we call fibrous joints, there are cartilaginous joints, and there are synovial joints. Fibrous joints are joints that have no joint cavity between the bones. So the bones are in close approximation to each other, and they are held together by dense, regular connective tissue proper. Cartilaginous joints, too, have no joint cavity between the bones, but instead of having dense, regular connective tissue between the bones, there's going to be a wedge of cartilage present, hence the name. Synovial joints are the joints that do have a joint cavity, and that joint cavity is filled with a fluid called synovium. The bones in a synovial joint are separated from each other, so they have to be attached to each other with ligaments. Remember, the difference between a tendon and a ligament is that a tendon attaches muscle to bone, and a ligament attaches bone to bone. Now, in a synovial joint, there will be a capsule that surrounds the entirety of the joint. Now, within these three structural categories, there are subtypes of joints, and we'll look at those next. We can talk about the mobility of a joint within any one of the three types of structural joints. For example, we talk about an immobile joint as being a synarthrosis. These are the most stable of the joints. A good example of this would be the sutures in the skull. If you look down on the lower left-hand side of this slide, you can see a skull, a human skull, and just make out the suture lines. These are considered synarthroses because these are joints that are immobile. They're very, very stable, but they are joints. They're places where bones come together. They articulate. The second type of mobility classification is amphiarthrosis. This is a slightly mobile joint. It's also quite stable because it doesn't move very much. A good example of an amphiarthrosis is an intervertebral joint. This image in the middle of the slide here shows two vertebrae and where they contact each other. Of course, there's going to be a disc that lies between the two vertebral bodies, but there's also going to be joints in other locations where the bones contact each other. These are referred to as facet joints. They do move, but they don't move very much. They are amphiarthrosis type. And finally, we talk about diarthrosis. That's a freely movable joint. And that's a joint that is the least stable among the three categories. A good example would be the shoulder joint, as shown in this image. The shoulder joint has a lot of movement associated with it. It is considered the diarthrosis type. It's wonderful that there is so much motion in the shoulder joint, but of course that means that the shoulder joint is more vulnerable to injury. It is the least stable category of movement. So let's go through the three structural types of joints now and talk about the subtypes that we find in each category. We'll begin with the fibrous joints. And remember, the fibrous joints have no joint cavity, and the bones are held together by dense, regular connective tissue proper. Within the fibrous joint category, there are suture joints, there are gomphosis joints, and there are syndesmosis joints. A lot of terminology associated with joints. Suture fibrous joints are the synarthrosis type. These are immobile, very stable joints. They have interlocking edges between the bones. So the edges are irregular, they're not smooth. If you think about, again, the joints that hold the skull bones together, those are suture type fibrous joints. The edges of those suture joints are very irregular, and they allow the bones to sort of interconnect with each other at the joint. The dense, regular connective tissue proper in suture joints in the skull, for example, is going to ossify as the individual ages. And if you think about that, that makes sense. The suture joint needs to be connective tissue when an individual is growing because the bones are growing. And so there needs to be some softness to that joint. But once the skull is completely formed, then it's perfectly reasonable for that connective tissue to ossify, to become more bone-like itself, because that joint is an immobile joint. It's not intended to have motion in it. The second type of fibrous joint is a gomphosis. This is also a synarthrosis type. So this is another joint that is immobile and very stable. A good way to think of a gomphosis is a peg inside a socket. So it fits into the socket perfectly. There's no extra open space in a gomphosis. Now there's only one place where you find a gomphosis type of fibrous joint in the human body, and that's the roots of the teeth. The roots of the teeth are set into the bone of the maxilla and the mandible, the jaw, and those teeth are set into these sockets that we call alveolar processes. The roots fit nicely into these alveolar processes. They fit sort of perfectly, like a peg in a socket. The third type a fibrous joint is called a syndesmosis. These types of fibrous joints are the amphiarthrosis variety in terms of their movement. Remember, we said an amphiarthrosis type of joint is slightly mobile, but still quite stable. So what you find in a syndesmosis joint is these strands of dense regular connective tissue proper that connect the bones. This is like a sheet of connective tissue in between two bones. And we call that sheet an interosseous membrane. So inter meaning between, osseous meaning bone. So a membrane, a sheet of connective tissue between bones. This is not a particularly mobile joint, but it is quite stable. It's found particularly between the tibia and the fibula in the leg, and between the radius and the ulna in the forearm. This slide, we're looking at drawings of the two kinds of syndesmosis type of fibrous joints. Remember, these are those interosseous membranes. You're looking at one right here between the radius and the ulna in the forearm. And then you're looking at the other one right here between the tibia and that little fibula bone in your lower leg. So those are the fibrous joints: suture, gomphosis, and syndesmosis. Now we'll look at the cartilaginous joints, and there are two types of cartilaginous joints. There are what are called synchondrosis cartilaginous joints, and there are symphysis cartilaginous joints. The synchondrosis type of cartilaginous joint has the synarthrosis type of movement. When you look at these are hyaline cartilage type joints. So you find them in the epiphyseal plates. Remember, those are the growth plates of the long bone. And that's a joint that's actually going to go away as the individual ages and the growth plate closes. You also find the synchondrosis joint type in the spheno-occipital joint. Remember, this is the joint towards the back of the head. This is another joint that's going to basically go away. It's going to fuse when an individual reaches their full growth. The final kind of synchondrosis joint is the costochondral joints in the rib cage. Now these are the joints between the ribs and the costal cartilage. I've got asterisks here because it's important to remember that that's different from the connection between the costal cartilage and the sternum. We're talking about the connection between the rib bone itself and the costal cartilage. And that's a synchondrosis type. The symphysis type of cartilaginous joint is found in the pubic symphysis, and we mentioned this joint before. It's also found in the intervertebral joints, so the space in between the vertebral body where the discs are. This is an amphiarthrosis type of joint. This is a joint that does have some movement within it, although limited. And this type of cartilaginous joint has fibrocartilage in it, not hyaline cartilage. On this slide, over on the left, you're looking at a radiograph. You can see the hand here up at the top. Here's the wrist. And you can see both radius and ulna here. And here you can see the epiphyseal plate, the growth plate in the ulna, and over here in the radius. So these are synchondrosis type of cartilaginous joints. These are joints. They are the connection point or the articulation point between two bones. They are synarthrosis type, which means they don't move. They're not intended to move, and they will eventually go away when the person finishes growing. But while they are open, they are serving as a joint. Over here on the right-hand side, you're looking at the front of a person's chest. You're looking at the sternum. Here in the center, you can see the clavicles or parts of the clavicles at the top, and then various ribs going down. In blue, you're looking at cartilage. And then you can see the bony parts of the ribs over at the edges. So remember, there is a joint between the bony rib and the costal cartilage. There's a joint right here, and this is a symphysis type of joint. This joint is made out of fibrocartilage, not hyaline cartilage. This joint is the amphiarthrosis type in terms of movement. It's slightly mobile, but still very stable. So we've looked at the three kinds of fibrous joints and the two kinds of cartilaginous joints, and we've talked about the three different types of movement that a joint can have. Let's move on now to look at the synovial joints. The synovial joints have the most complex anatomy of all of the joints. So remember, a synovial joint has a joint cavity. It has a space between the bones that are part of the joint. And the bones are going to be connected to each other with ligaments. And the joint is going to be surrounded by a capsule, what is sometimes called an articular capsule, but is, I think, more commonly called a joint capsule. That joint capsule is fibrous and tough. On the outside of the joint capsule, there's a very fibrous layer that is protective, and it helps keep the joint intact. It's very preventative in terms of having the joint sort of fall apart. On the inner surface of the joint capsule, there is a synovial membrane. And this is not a tough fibrous layer. This is a much softer layer. This is the layer that actually has the cells in it that are going to produce and secrete the fluid inside of the synovial joint, what we call the synovial fluid. This is not a watery fluid. This fluid has a very distinctive consistency. It's almost oily when you touch it. It has a very unique sort of slippery feel to it. Now, inside of the synovial joint, if you take the capsule away and you can see the bones that are involved in the joint, these bones are going to have a layer of hyaline cartilage on their ends. This is articular cartilage, remember. It does a couple of things. It protects the end of the bone because the bone is going to have movement within a synovial joint. And it also just helps to lubricate the joint. It reduces the friction when the bones move. It's also sort of a cushion in there, that articular cartilage, because joints can get compressed. So the articular cartilage is really facilitating all of the movement that goes on in a synovial joint. The synovial fluid that fills up the joint cavity, remember, it's being produced and secreted by the cells on the inner surface of the joint capsule, that synovial membrane, but it's also being filtered into the synovial joint out of the blood. So the amount of synovial fluid is going to change under certain conditions. when a synovial joint becomes inflamed, for example, because of injury, more and more fluid will enter the joint from the bloodstream. And that's what can cause a synovial joint to swell up and get, larger and tighter and more painful when it's injured. Synovial fluid is critical to the health of a joint. It is literally going to feed the cells inside the joint, particularly the chondrocytes that are in the articular cartilage. It's also just there to help lubricate the joint and sort of cushion the joint. Remember, it's quite viscous and oily and slippery. On this slide, over on the left, you're looking at a drawing of a synovial joint. We've taken a section through the bones so that we can peek inside the joint. Remember, the capsule is on the exterior of the joint. It's got a fibrous layer that faces the outside of the joint, and it's got a synovial membrane on the inside that's quite cellular. You can see a bone here with articular cartilage on its surface. You can see another one here with articular cartilage. That cartilage is a critical component to the function of this joint. The fluid, the synovial fluid, fills the joint cavity in here. Over here on the right, we're looking at a radiograph of the knee. So this up here is the lower half of the femur, and this is the upper half of the tibia. So we could call this the distal femur and the proximal tibia. You can see the patella right here. It's superimposed over the femur, but it's right here. Here's the fibula, the end of the fibula right here. This knee is a synovial joint. You can't see the joint capsule. You can't see the synovial fluid. You can't see any of that. And the reason you can't see it is because it's soft tissue. And you cannot see soft tissue to any detail on a radiograph. All you can see is that there's a space here. There's a nice, healthy space between these bones, and that space is this synovial joint.